Today on the Transplant Help, we're going to be discussing pre-transplant anxiety. Not only what it can do to you, but what you need to be doing to it to keep it at bay. So stay tuned. Hey folks, welcome to Transplant Help today. My name is Jim Merle, and today we're talking about pre-transplant anxiety. Now, I know this is a needed topic because I see it coming up over and over again on these Facebook transplant pages and other things where people are facing transplant and basically they're scared to death. And if you ever feel that way, please know that you're not alone in that. I myself was scared to death of transplant prior to it happening, and it caused me a lot of anxiety. That is a lot of worry, a lot of stress, a lot of whatever you want to call it. My life was pretty much miserable at times because of worrying about the transplant process. So that's what I've tried to do on this whole program, the Transplant Helper. Every episode that I make is to help to relieve some of that anxiety as we go along. And hopefully today's program, where I focus directly on that, will be a huge help as well. Now, when we start out talking about pre-transplant anxiety, I think it's good to understand what many of us go through. And so I'll just share with you a little bit of my story so you can really comprehend what I'm talking about. And it basically goes back to a time about, I guess now 6 years ago or so, when I was facing transplant. I would wake up oftentimes almost on a regular basis, maybe even a weekly basis, basically terrified of the transplant surgery. So much, the basic nightmare I was going through over and over again was me being rolled to the operating room, winding through the halls, and about the time the operating room doors would open, I would jump up off the gurney screaming, "I don't want to do it," and run away, therefore forfeiting or passing over my opportunity to have that life-saving heart transplant that I knew I really needed. And I think the reason that came about is because in my mind, the way I saw transplant back then was basically, and I know this is not a good way to think, but basically, okay, they're going to cut your chest open, take your heart out, throw it in a trash can, put a new one in, and hope it starts. That's the way I thought about it, and I was terrified of that. I didn't want to have a day and a time and a moment set when my life could potentially be over. So that caused me a ton of anxiety, and I had to face that head on. So today I want to give you 3 tips you can use to face your anxiety, whatever it is. It may not be to that extent, it may be much worse or less than that, but to face your anxiety head on and to help you to overcome it, if not at least lower those anxiety levels just a bit so you can make it on toward transplant. Here's what they are. Number 1, I think the first thing we need to keep in mind as far as our anxiety goes is to keep in mind that we need more and more education. Now, obviously I'm saying that because I am a transplant educator, but I also think it's very important as we face the process that we really understand the whole process itself. And I think the more research, the more study, the more digging that we can do is to find out more about our transplant, its outcomes, its potentials, how the surgeries are done, the medications. The more research and learning we can do on the front side of things, the lower our anxiety levels can go. Now, let me point out in that when you do your digging, your research, your study, you need to be looking for good, balanced resources. And by balanced, I mean don't be searching the internet for men who died on the heart transplant table. Don't be searching for internet about people who died from transplant medications, because obviously that's exactly what you're going to find. Be searching for real life people like myself. By the way, I think my videos are pretty handy for this, but be searching for videos that come from people or from articles that come from people, blogs, whatever you want to call them, where people are talking about the real lives that they live and where they're talking about it in a balanced perspective from what is good, what's bad, and what kind of falls in the middle. Also be cautious, and believe me, I wasn't good at this, but be very cautious about reading too much medical materials. And I mean by that, by reading too much or reading or watching too many videos that come from the medical side of things, because obviously they're going to be a little bit more forthright, but yet a little bit more blunt, and probably not give you all the good. If they had the greatest outcomes in the world, maybe they wouldn't even be on the internet. And so you need to be kind of keeping that in mind. Let me give you an example of how that works out. Let's suppose that your doctor prescribes you a medicine. You go down a local pharmacy, you pick it up. If you just start popping those pills as prescribed on the bottle, probably every day, you may not meet with very many, if any, side effects from that medication. However, if you're like the average human being, like myself, if you go in, pull that medicine bottle out, pull the pamphlet out of the bag with it, and start reading all the potential side effects, which always, for any medicine just about, include the possibility of death, you're going to be so afraid of that you won't actually take the medicine. Or if you do, you're suddenly going to discover so many side effects that maybe you're not really there. And so just be cautious about that. But I think the number one thing you need to do is to find yourself a good education, a balanced education into your situation and what lies ahead. In the second place, I think one of the biggest things we can do is come to a realization. So education, now realization. And by that I mean you need to sit down. And if it takes a pencil and pen, paper, whatever, go ahead and do this. You need to be sitting down, thinking to yourself, maybe writing down in front of yourself exactly the life that you're living now, exactly how things really are. Because I know there are going to be days when you're facing transplant because of the fear of transplant, whatever, and even post-transplant, this will be handy, when you're going to look at your life and say, hey, wait a minute, this is not even worth it. The possibilities, the outcomes, the scary things that can happen, this is not even worth going through. And I know I felt that way, and I know many do. And so it's really, really good for us to sit down and write about the truth of how our lives really are. Because what you'll find, for my example, you back up 5 or so years ago, if I wrote down, and I did at one point, if I wrote down what goes on in my daily life, here's what it would consist of: being exhausted, being tired all the time, being anxious all the time, sleeping 16, 18 hours a day, having symptoms such as shortness of breath, hard to focus, to think, you name it, heart transplant, and at that time, stage 4 heart failure wise, I was not having a good life. If you write down the things that I was able to do, that would be a very short list. Not able to do housework, not able to play with the kids, not able to go shopping, not able to go out with my friends. All these things came about. And if I write down the reality of that, then it was easier for me to see, hey, if you've got any possibility, any opportunity, any chance at life, that's going to be better. And that even comes down to toward the end of my transplant process, when the doctors were walking into the room on a regular basis and saying, Jim, you've got a year to live, 6 months to live, 3 months to live, a month to live, a week to live. And I know that's not what I wanted. So we have to think about the reality. What are the real outcomes if we do nothing, if we never go through the transplant process, versus if we do, the possibilities that are there and the opportunities that can be afforded us. Will there be good times and bad? Yes. There'll be plenty of good times and a few bad times, but you just have to face that with a relative or a reality type thinking perspective. Now, here we go with the last one. Number 3, I think it's so important to bring those anxiety levels down, to avoid being anxious. It's so important that we also start with preparation. And by that I mean you've educated yourself, now you're meeting with reality. Now there has to be some preparation of the mind, because a whole lot of surviving this transplant life and doing well at it is to prepare your mind to think positively, to put aside negative thoughts, to put aside the terrible possibilities and start thinking more positively about things. Because as I said a moment ago, there'll be plenty of good times, but there will be some bad times. There'll be times when you have days where you wonder if it was all worth it. There'll be times when you're going to have days when the medications are going to, give you so many symptoms, upset your stomach, basically other things where you're going to say, oh man, I wish I'd never done this. But having that positive outlook and preparing our minds with this preparation that I'm talking about to get ready to face those days, that makes all the difference. If we go into this thing just thinking everything's going to be lovely and it'll all be flowers and floating white clouds, that's probably not going to be the case. So we have to prepare our minds, our attitudes in order to face those times. Now, you know as well as I do, and it's actually been proven in the medical world, that many of the things we deal with medically don't start as medical problems, they start as emotional problems. And so just getting the right mindset, getting your attitude right, that can make all the difference. Because why? Because as I'm talking about all day with you, there is going to be a level, and there will be a level of anxiety that goes along with transplant, but I think these 3 things can help. Number 1, education. Number 2, realization. And number 3, preparation, getting ready for what lies ahead. Now, if this has helped you out in any way, I hope that you'll take time to like, subscribe, and share these things. Maybe even hit the bell notification there beside the subscribe button so you can be notified when I attempt to put out content which hopefully will help you as well as myself to advocate, educate, and motivate fellow transplant patients. Thank you so much for your time today, and until next time, stay stronger, friends.